She was still, so still, beneath the silk sheets that glistened like spilled milk in the candlelight. The Queen of England, revered and untouchable, stared upward through the canopy of her bed, unblinking. Her breath came in quiet gulps, steady but uncertain, as though each inhale might betray her. At her side, the surgeon moved with gloved precision, his eyes flicking from her trembling wrist to the tray of gleaming instruments beside him. He was not a man given to hesitation. And yet tonight, he hesitated. They called him a miracle worker. A man born with fingers kissed by divine purpose and a mind shaped by anatomy and duty. But in the antechambers of Whitehall, behind closed doors where powdered wigs whispered and courtiers averted their eyes, they spoke in softer voices. They said he had no soul. That he could open a body like one might a book and feel nothing for what was written inside. His name was Dr. Ambrose Godwin, and from the moment he first laid eyes on the Queen, he saw not her royalty, but her fragility. And fragility, he believed, was not to be coddled. It was to be challenged. Corrected. Ambrose had not always been like this. Once, in the soft green countryside of Devonshire, he had been a curious child with too many questions and not enough warmth. His father was a stern parish doctor who believed in discipline, not comfort. The boy learned early that affection was a myth and that pain, when administered precisely, could bring clarity. When his mother fell ill with consumption and his father ordered Ambrose to watch her die without flinching, he obeyed. And when she finally passed, he was made to dissect the body under supervision, to understand the wages of weakness. That night changed him. By 15, he could recite the contents of the human body as fluently as scripture. By 20, he had removed a gangrenous leg with nothing more than a saw and an audience of noblemen who applauded his efficiency. By 30, he was appointed royal surgeon to the Queen. She was young then. Still radiant, still unspoiled by the grotesque burdens of monarchy. And when she complained of the aches in her abdomen, the Queen's ladies thought it trifling, a female malaise that would pass with rest and lavender. But Godwin did not believe in rest. He believed in the knife. The first incision was small. A test. The Queen flinched, but did not scream. And that, Ambrose would later recall, was the moment he saw her differently. Not as a sovereign, not as a patient, but as a vessel for something far more interesting. Resistance. She would resist him for years. In glances. In tears. In whispers to her ladies. But not once in public. Because he had earned the crown's favor, and favor meant immunity. The court saw her health improve in spurts. They called it genius. They did not know that genius, in Ambrose's hands, often looked like torment. What no one saw were the marks. The bruises that bloomed beneath her gowns. The way she flinched when he entered her chamber. The way she begged in private for a second opinion and was told that the royal surgeon was final. The Queen was property, in the end. She belonged to the nation. And Ambrose was merely maintaining what was his to keep in working order. As her ailments deepened, so did his fascination. He began to believe the pain was necessary. That by drawing it from her body, he was pulling sin from the soul. That the more she suffered, the purer she became. She, of course, never said this aloud. But she stopped resisting. And so he cut again. The Queen rarely spoke in his presence now. When Ambrose entered her chambers, the air thickened as though the tapestries themselves held their breath. She sat upright on the chaise longue, pale as pressed linen, her hands folded with mechanical precision atop her lap. The courtiers who once vied for her laughter had long since fled these rooms, their excuses murmured behind fans or concealed in hasty retreats down side corridors. No one wanted to witness healing when it came wrapped in silence and smelling faintly of burnt flesh. But Ambrose was not deterred by isolation. In fact, he relished it. The fewer eyes upon his work, the freer his hands became. His treatments had evolved. What began with poultices and leeching now included invasive bleedings, steel needles threaded through muscle, and strange tinctures administered in gasps rather than sips. The queen no longer resisted. Not out of trust, but out of resignation. There was a look in her eyes now, a faraway vacancy, as if she had departed her body and left behind only the royal shell. He told the court she was improving. That her blood was less sluggish. That her womb, once rebellious and cold, showed signs of warming under his care. It was all nonsense. But who would dare question him? He was the one who saved the Duke of Cumberland from fever, who removed the tumor from a baron's neck with nothing but a blade and a prayer, who held the trust of the king himself. It was said in quiet circles that Godwin could do anything but resurrect the dead, and that even this he might attempt if given permission. Yet something had begun to gnaw at him. In the dim hours between appointments, Ambrose found himself drawn not to his textbooks or journals, but to the Queen's earlier portraits. There she stood, fierce-eyed, head tilted in that familiar way that made even Parliament squirm. That woman was gone now. Reduced. And for the first time, he felt the stirrings of doubt, not for what he had done, but for how little she had fought. He began to question whether suffering truly purified. Whether her silence was the silence of ascension, or of surrender. But those thoughts were fleeting. He buried them beneath routines, beneath the sterile clink of instruments and the ceremonial dignity of his white gloves. And then came the day her voice returned. It was during a treatment intended to relieve humoral pressure, a practice of his own invention involving heat and puncture. He pressed the needle against her spine. She did not flinch. But as it pierced, a soft voice escaped her lips, barely a whisper, barely formed. "You enjoy this?" He froze. She did not repeat it. Her face remained blank, her gaze affixed to the distant ceiling. But something in the stillness of the room shifted. He was no longer the sole architect of this ritual. She had spoken. And in speaking, she had named him. Ambrose's hand trembled. That night, he returned to his quarters and opened a letter long buried among his possessions. It was from his mother, written in her final days, long before her body became a specimen beneath his blade. The ink was faded, but the words clear. Asterisk, your gift is not in what you do with your hands, Ambrose. It is what you feel in your chest. If that ever goes silent, do not trust yourself. Asterisk. He had laughed when he first read it. Now, he read it again and did not laugh. But neither did he stop. Because something inside him whispered louder. A different voice. One cultivated in youth, in cold surgeries and long winters, in silence and withheld praise. That voice did not ask for empathy. It asked only for obedience to its logic. And the logic was simple. She was broken. He was there to fix her. Even if it hurt. Especially if it hurt. They began to call it a mystery illness. The Queen's condition, once so easily explained by the surgeon's authoritative tongue, imbalance of bile, inflammation of the womb, nervous affliction, now confounded even those who once echoed his certainty. She grew weaker, thinner, translucent like a painting left too long in the sun. Her voice was barely above a breath, and her eyes, once commanding and bright, now wandered aimlessly as though she were forever searching for some thread she'd lost long ago. But she still endured the treatments. She did not cry. She did not plead. She simply existed, and allowed herself to be handled like something that must be kept from spoiling. Dr. Godwin intensified his regimen. If the Queen failed to respond, it was not because of his methods, he insisted, it was because her will was fragile. He began to administer his remedies at night, alone, without the gaze of witnesses. Her attendants were dismissed, and when questioned, he merely stated that privacy was necessary for matters of female constitution. No one argued. The crown needed her cured. Godwin had cured before. But in truth, his belief in medicine had frayed. He no longer considered the body something sacred. It had become terrain, something to be conquered, corrected, even punished. And if the queen's body resisted him, if it withstood each incision, each dose, each scalding compress, then perhaps the fault was not in him. Perhaps the sickness lived deeper than any scalpel could reach. He had begun to suspect that the queen did not want to be healed. The thought unsettled him. It returned again and again in the long hours, twisting itself around the memory of her whispered accusation. You enjoy this, a sentence that echoed in his sleep. Was she refusing to improve as an act of rebellion? Was her stillness, her submission, in truth a form of sabotage? The idea thrilled him, terrified him. And so he sought to break it. One evening, beneath the veil of another private session, he ordered her moved to a chamber without windows. She was kept in shadow now. He insisted it was for her sensitivity to light, but it was not. It was for control. The shadows obeyed him. The queen, slowly, began to obey less. She turned her head away when he approached. She refused his tonics. Her body remained limp, but there was something hard beneath it now, a will sharpened by despair. A cold dignity that frightened him more than any royal decree. He accused her of resisting. She said nothing. He demanded to know if she wished to die. She closed her eyes. And so he punished her in the only way he knew how. He made her bleed. Small cuts, always justified. Always necessary. To balance her humors. To release her stagnation. To purify her blood. He explained it all in calm tones, even as the bowl beneath her filled with more crimson than reason allowed. When attendants raised concerns, he silenced them with a look. No one dared challenge the man who claimed the queen was alive only because of him. But in truth, she was dying. And so was he. Not in body, but in belief. He began to speak to her as he worked. At first, his words were medical, clinical. Then they turned personal. Apologetic. Desperate. He told her she reminded him of his mother. Of what it meant to be necessary. Of how pain could be beautiful if one only looked hard enough. She never replied. And that silence was more unbearable than screams. He did not know it yet, but her silence was not passive. It was her resistance. She had taken from him what he valued most, acknowledgement. Her suffering no longer validated his genius. It now mirrored it. Cold. Detached. Inhuman. He could not bear it. So the treatments became more violent. Less rational. There was no longer talk of cure. Only control. By now, the queen was no longer the queen. Her body still occupied the throne, her seal still adorned proclamations, and her likeness still graced medals passed through trembling hands. But the woman herself, the soul once known for her clever jests, her private laughter, her gaze that silenced entire rooms, had receded. She lived now in fragments. Her voice, when it came, was thin and hollow. Her limbs were heavy things she no longer owned. She stared at walls, at the space between curtains, at nothing. And still he came. Dr. Godwin entered each morning with the same ritual. Gloves, rolled precisely. Apron, immaculate. Tools, aligned with military perfection. But he had stopped speaking to others. His attendants watched him with unease. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His beard was never quite trimmed, and he muttered now, little asides, meant for no one, except perhaps for her. He had become a man whose authority could no longer be separated from his delusion. He believed she was hiding something. That her illness masked a deeper rebellion. That deep inside her body, beneath the failing organs, beyond the blood and bone, there was a will resisting him, corrupting everything he tried to mend. He spoke to that will now. Not to her face, but to her abdomen, her chest, her neck. His voice was low and reverent, like a priest addressing a demon. One evening, he initiated a procedure no one had authorized. He called it internal revitalization, a concoction of pressure, opiates, and deliberate trauma meant to shock the body into awakening. It had never been done before. There were no notes in the royal records, no colleagues to consult. But in his mind, the science was sound. He believed that if she felt one moment of real, pure agony, it might reawaken the sovereign within. She did not scream. Not once. But she wept. It was the first tear anyone had seen from her in over a year. A single line down her cheek. Not from pain, not from fear, but from knowing. Knowing that this would never stop, not so long as he drew breath. She had once ruled empires with a glance. Now, she could not move her hand. The royal court began to fracture. Whispers turned to questions. Why had no one else examined the queen? Why were her private treatments now a state secret? Why was the royal surgeon the only man who dared speak of her health, even as her figure faded behind tapestries and closed doors? But no one acted. Ambrose was too trusted, too feared. He had built his fortress not with walls, but with reputation. And no one wanted to be the one to accuse a savior of being a torturer. So the charade continued. Until the king himself entered the chamber. It was unannounced. A late hour. No fanfare. He had heard things. Dark things. And when he saw her, gaunt and unmoving beneath thick woolen blankets, her arms bruised, her throat pale and mottled, he did not ask for diagnosis. He simply turned to Ambrose and said, "Asterisk, what have you done?" Asterisk. The word shattered the room. Ambrose stammered. For the first time in his life, he could not speak in full sentences. He gestured to his tools, to his records. He said, "Treatment, necessary, asterisk, resistance." Asterisk. But the king saw no patient here. Only a corpse in waiting. Dr. Godwin was removed from his post that night. Not arrested, not publicly denounced. The crown could not afford scandal. He was sent into quiet exile, under the guise of retirement. Given a house near the coast. A stipend. A final mercy. And the queen. She lived. Not long. But long enough to speak one final time. To a new physician, one gentle and confused, she said, asterisk, he thought he was healing me. But all he ever wanted was to hear me cry. The cottage overlooked grey water and wind-beaten cliffs. It was the kind of place reserved for those England wished to forget without disgrace. Here, Dr. Ambrose Godwin paced alone, his footsteps tracing deep lines in the wooden floor. The sea was loud, but his thoughts were louder. He did not write. He did not read. He no longer spoke to anyone but himself. He had once imagined exile would be temporary. That the court would beg for his return when the queen relapsed, when her new caretakers failed. But the summons never came. The letters from Whitehall ceased entirely. And when he asked a former colleague in a trembling scrawl how she fared, he received only a one-line reply, asterisk, she no longer speaks your name. Asterisk. It hollowed him. He had built his life upon the idea that suffering could sanctify. That pain, administered with purpose, could make one whole again. But the queen had defied that belief. She had endured, yes, but she had not been remade. She had slipped away beneath his fingers, not because he failed to act, but because he acted too much. Too confidently. Too often. He had mistaken her silence for submission, her endurance for gratitude. But now he saw them for what they truly were. Warnings. In the final year of his life, Ambrose took to long walks along the cliffs. He spoke aloud as he walked, composing elaborate dialogues in which he defended himself before imaginary tribunals. He recited diagnoses, listed treatments, insisted again and again that he had meant to save her. The wind never answered. What haunted him was not her suffering. It was her refusal to break. He had believed, deep down, that if he could reduce a queen to pain, then he could control anything. Even the soul. But she had withheld that from him, and in doing so, she had revealed his power for what it truly was, a performance. Brilliant. Precise. But empty. One evening, a fisherman passing his cottage found the door ajar. Inside, the doctor sat in his chair, eyes open, untouched meal before him. The fire had long since burned out. There was no note. No final word. Only a journal open on his desk with a single line etched in a trembling hand. Asterisk, what if I was the illness? Asterisk. The queen died not long after, her body worn thin, but her memory strangely untouched. The court mourned her publicly, yet privately seemed relieved, as though a burden had finally exhaled. History recorded her as dignified, mysterious, tragically frail. The story of her final years was left out, softened by euphemisms, dulled by official narratives. But the women of the palace remembered. The attendants. The chambermaids. The ones who had glimpsed her bruises and heard her whisper at night to no one. In hushed voices, they told one another the truth. That the greatest wound the queen ever suffered was not of the body, but of belief. That her physician, hailed as her savior, had become her jailer. That the line between care and cruelty had been crossed so slowly, so rationally, no one had seen it happen. Not even him. And still, the question lingers. Had Ambrose Godwin lived longer, would he have sought redemption, or simply refined his methods? Would the court, given enough time and desperation, have invited him back? And what does it say of us that we still leonize men for their brilliance, even when it leaves bodies in its wake? She was once a victim, we believed. A fragile queen brought low by disease. But the truth is more terrifying. She was sacrificed at the altar of expertise. And her silence, unbroken, deliberate, was the last thing she ever owned. What would you have done in her place? What would you have done in his? And when healing begins to feel like power, who decides when it becomes something else?